In the 17th century, love of the same sex was a death sentence, a sin that could not be judged even before God. Yet, right on the throne of France, there was a man who dared to live true to himself. That was Philippe I, Duke of Orléans, the younger brother of the Sun King. A noble prince who delighted in wearing dresses, adorning himself with jewelry, and openly declaring his burning love for young men. And the person holding the heart of this lonely prince was the Chevalier de Lorraine. The love between Philippe and Lorraine was not merely a night of fleeting carnal indulgence, but a battle for survival between two men in a society that wanted to erase their existence. Can love in the dark win against the glory of royalty? Yet this defiance was not born in a vacuum. To grasp how a penniless younger son became the master of Versailles' darkest corners, we must first examine the peculiar stage upon which he played. We must look at the twisted upbringing of the man he would come to dominate, Philippe, the Duke of Orléans. France in the mid-17th century was a kingdom haunted by the ghosts of civil war. The Fronde, a series of violent rebellions by the nobility against the crown, had terrified the young Louis XIV. He grew up with a singular obsession: order. He would tame the nobility. He would centralize all power. He would ensure that no one could ever challenge the king again. But there was a specific danger that kept the royal advisors awake at night: the cadet, the younger brother. History was littered with examples of younger brothers of kings who grew jealous, who became figureheads for rebellion, who tore kingdoms apart in their lust for the crown. Gaston d'Orléans, the uncle of Louis and Philippe, had been a lifelong thorn in the side of the monarchy. So a cold and calculated decision was made regarding the young Philippe. To protect Louis, Philippe had to be neutralized, not killed but rendered politically impotent. If Louis was to be the son, masculine, martial, authoritative, Philippe would be encouraged to be the moon, soft, decorative, and yielding. From his earliest years, Philippe was dressed in girls' clothing. While Louis was taught to ride war horses and study fortification, Philippe was encouraged to play with ribbons, to experiment with makeup, to obsess over the placement of a beauty mark or the cut of a lace collar. From childhood, Philippe was deliberately shaped into someone harmless, pampered, softened, and made emotionally dependent by design. The Queen Mother would call him her little girl. It was a psychological castration performed with silk and velvet, and it worked, perhaps too well. Philippe grew up with absolutely no desire for the throne. He had no interest in leading armies or sitting in council meetings. Instead, he created his own world. He became the undisputed king of fashion, taste, and of the grand theatrical balls that defined the era. He was flamboyant, openly effeminate, and unapologetically attracted to men. But this upbringing created a vacuum. Philippe was raised to be dependent. He was raised to need approval, to need affection, to need a strong figure, to anchor his chaotic emotional life. The crown had hoped that by making him effeminate, they would make him weak. They failed to realize that they were simply creating a different kind of vulnerability. They had created a prince who was desperate to be possessed. It was into this psychological breach that the Chevalier de Lorraine stepped. He arrived in Paris around 1658, a teenager with the face of a fallen angel. He was born in 1643, making him 3 years younger than Monsieur. He came from the House of Lorraine, a family that was technically foreign, sovereign princes in their own right, but who had woven themselves into the French aristocracy. However, being the fourth son of the Count of Harcourt meant Philippe de Lorraine had no inheritance. He had his name, he had his sword, and he had a physical beauty that contemporaries struggled to describe without sounding hyperbolic. Writers of the time called him as beautiful as an angel. He had fine aristocratic features, a mane of luxurious hair, and eyes that could shift from melting tenderness to icy cruelty in a heartbeat. But unlike Monsieur, whose effeminacy was soft and fluttering, the Chevalier's beauty was sharp. It was predatory. He was a man who knew exactly what he looked like, and exactly what that look could buy him. He did not stumble into Monsieur's orbit by accident. The court of the young Duke of Orléans was a magnet for young men with ambition and flexible morals. It was a subculture, a homosexual underworld, existing right at the pinnacle of the most Catholic kingdom in Europe. It was a place of high stakes, where a witty remark could earn a pension and a faux pas could mean social exile. The Chevalier de Lorraine watched. He waited. He saw the other favorites, the mignons, flitting around Monsieur like butterflies. He saw the Comte de Guiche, arrogant and dashing. He saw the others who played the game for short-term gains, happy with a bag of gold or a new horse. The Chevalier wanted more. He didn't just want Monsieur's body, he wanted his mind. He wanted to be the lens through which the Duke of Orléans saw the world. His ascent was subtle at first. He entered the household as a friend, a companion in debauchery. He and Monsieur shared a love for the high life, for gambling, for masquerades, for the thrill of the forbidden. But the Chevalier introduced an edge of danger that Monsieur found intoxicating. Philippe was a prince who had been wrapped in cotton wool his whole life. The Chevalier was a man who felt like a blade. By the mid-1660s, the trap was snapped shut. The Chevalier was officially appointed as maître de camp of the cavalry and given a position in the household. But these titles were irrelevant. His real title was absolute master of Philippe's heart. The transformation in Monsieur's household was palpable. In the early days, there had been a sense of fun, of frivolous camaraderie. Under the Chevalier's influence, the atmosphere curdled. It became a place of suspicion and exclusion. By the late 1660s, Lorraine no longer needed titles. He controlled access, finances, and affection. Anyone who wanted something from Monsieur had to pass through him. If a courtier wanted to speak to Monsieur, they had to go through Lorraine. If a merchant wanted to sell fabrics to the most spendthrift man in France, they had to bribe Lorraine. And Monsieur, he was entranced. He was also terrified. The Chevalier had discovered the key to controlling Philippe: insecurity. He would shower Monsieur with affection one day and then turn cold and mocking the next. He would flirt openly with other men, sometimes the very men Monsieur himself admired, creating a triangle of jealousy that left the prince desperate to win back his lover's favor. It was emotional abuse, weaponized and refined into an art form. The king, Louis XIV, watched this development with growing irritation. Louis was a man who believed in hierarchy. A prince of the blood should not be ruled by an inferior. He tolerated his brother's homosexuality. It was an open secret, laughed about behind fans, but he could not tolerate the subversion of power. The Chevalier was becoming a rival center of gravity. But Louis had a more pressing concern: the succession. Monsieur needed to produce heirs. The Orléans line was the backup for the Bourbon dynasty. If Louis's sons died, Philippe's sons would be king. So, a marriage was arranged. And the woman chosen for this impossible task was Henrietta of England, known as Minette. Minette was the sister of King Charles II of England. She was fragile, incredibly thin, intelligent, and possessed of a melancholy charm that captivated almost everyone, except her husband. She married Philippe in 1661. It was a disaster from the start. Imagine the dynamic: a sensitive, intelligent princess forced into a marriage with a man who resented her very existence, living in a household controlled by a lover who viewed her as a mortal enemy. The Chevalier de Lorraine saw Minette not as a woman, but as a threat to his revenue stream. If Monsieur loved his wife, he might listen to her. If he listened to her, he might stop signing over the revenues of abbeys and estates to the Lorraine family. Therefore, Minette had to be destroyed, not physically, not yet, but socially and emotionally. The Chevalier launched a campaign of whispers. He mocked her piety. He encouraged Monsieur to criticize her appearance. When Minette became pregnant, instead of being treated with care, she was forced to endure long, rattling carriage rides between palaces because the Chevalier wanted to go to a party. There's a particularly cruel story from this time that illustrates the Chevalier's dominance. Minette, heavily pregnant and unwell, asked to stay at the quiet chateau of Saint-Cloud to rest. Monsieur, at the Chevalier's urging, refused. He insisted the entire court move to Villers-Cotterêts, a journey that was exhausting and painful. Why? Because the Chevalier was bored with Saint-Cloud and preferred the hunting at Villers-Cotterêts. The comfort of the future mother of France's princes was less important than the whim of the favorite. Minette appealed to the king. She and Louis had a close relationship. Some whispered too close, bordering on a flirtation that had preceded her marriage. She poured out her heart to him. She told him of the insults, the lack of money, the way the Chevalier's friends would snicker when she entered a room. Louis was sympathetic, but he was also cautious. He needed Monsieur to be compliant. Interfering in his brother's domestic arrangements was a minefield. He scolded Philippe. He urged him to treat his wife better, but he stopped short of removing the cause of the rot. Emboldened by the king's hesitation, the Chevalier grew reckless. He began to believe he was untouchable. He was amassing a fortune. He held abbeys in commandant, meaning he took the vast profits of religious institutions without doing any of the spiritual work. He was drawing pensions from the crown. He was one of the richest men in France, but hubris is a dangerous thing at Versailles. The conflict reached a boiling point in late 1669. The Chevalier had overstepped. He had been involved in a clumsy intrigue to secure a bishopric for one of his minions, a move that directly challenged the king's authority over church appointments. At the same time, Minette's pleas to her brother, the King of England, were becoming frantic. She was a key asset in Louis's foreign policy. He needed her to negotiate a secret treaty with England. If she was miserable, the treaty was at risk. The geopolitical weight of an Anglo-French alliance suddenly rested on the fragile shoulders of an unhappy wife and the arrogance of a greedy lover. Louis XIV realized that the domestic problem at the Palais Royal was now a matter of national security. The Sun King decided to burn the shadow away. The arrest we witnessed at the beginning was the result. It was a surgical strike. Louis didn't consult his brother. He didn't warn him. He simply removed the Chevalier from the board. When the Chevalier was dragged to the Château d'If, the Alcatraz of its day, a rock in the Mediterranean, most of the court breathed a sigh of relief. Minette certainly did. She believed the nightmare was over. She believed that with the devil gone, she could finally build a relationship with her husband. She was wrong. Monsieur's reaction to the arrest was not one of submission, but of violent rebellion. He didn't just cry, he went on strike. He refused to attend council. He refused to sleep with his wife. He refused to speak to the king. He packed up his entire household and left for the countryside, creating a scandalous visible rift in the monarchy. Louis XIV found himself in a humiliating position. He could crush a foreign army, he could silence a parliament, but he couldn't force his brother to stop sulking. The weeks dragged on. The business of the state was stalling because Monsieur, who controlled significant lands and revenues, was non-cooperative. Finally, a compromise was reached. It was a testament to the Chevalier's power that even in disgrace, he dictated terms. He would be released from prison, but he was banished from France. He was to go to Rome. Monsieur accepted this barely. He returned to court, sullen and angry, treating Minette with icy silence, blaming her for his lover's exile. The Chevalier arrived in Rome in early 1670. He was 27 years old. He was in exile, yes, but he was far from defeated. He set up a small court in Rome, surrounded by young Italians, living off the massive remittances Monsieur sent him in secret. He wrote daily letters to Philippe, letters filled with declarations of love, but also filled with venom against Minette. In the heat of the Roman summer, the Chevalier de Lorraine sat in his rented palazzo, brooding, plotting, and waiting. He knew Philippe better than anyone. He knew that Philippe's resistance to Minette would eventually break her. Back in France, Minette was triumphant in politics. She had successfully negotiated the Treaty of Dover between England and France, but she was dying inside. She was physically wasting away, plagued by severe digestive pain. She was paranoid, seeing the Chevalier's agents in every shadow, whispering to her friends that a trap was tightening around her. But no amount of paranoia could prepare her for the afternoon of June 29th, 1670. Death! It is death! The scream rips through the stifling air of the Salon of the Nobles at Saint-Cloud. The porcelain cup shatters on the floor, spilling the chicory water across the parquet. Henrietta of England, Madame, collapses into the arms of her terrified ladies-in-waiting. Her face is contorted in a rictus of agony that seems impossible for a human body to endure. She clutches her side, her nails digging into the silk of her gown, gasping that a fire is consuming her from the inside. "I have been poisoned," she cries out, her voice ragged but distinct enough for every person in the room to hear. "The chicory water. I have been poisoned." Pandemonium erupts. Servants drop trays. Aristocratic ladies begin to weep or faint. The message is sent sprinting down the corridors to find Monsieur. The greatest scandal of the 17th century had begun. When Philippe, the Duke of Orléans, arrives, the scene is chaotic. His wife is being carried to her bed, writhing in pain. But the eyes of the court are not just on the dying woman, they are fixed on him. They are watching for his reaction. Does he look guilty? Does he look relieved? Monsieur appears genuinely distressed, but his distress is frantic, performative, centered on the mess of the situation rather than the tragedy of the suffering. He orders doctors to be summoned. He demands to know what was in the cup. In a moment that has been analyzed for 300 years, the chicory water remaining in the pot is tested. Not by a scientist, but by a courtier who drinks it. He suffers no ill effects. Another portion is given to a dog. The dog does not die. Monsieur points to this as proof. You see, it is just colic, it is just the vapors. But Minette knows. As the hours drag on, her body begins to fail with terrifying speed. Her extremities turn cold. Her pulse becomes an erratic flutter. The pain is so severe that this delicate royal woman is reduced to animalistic groans. The king, Louis XIV, arrives from Versailles with the queen. When the Sun King enters the death chamber, he is visibly shaken. He had a genuine affection for Minette, her wit, her grace, her intelligence. He kneels by her bedside, weeping. He speaks to her of God and courage. But Minette looks at him with eyes already clouding with death and whispers, "Oh my God, why must I die so young?" The doctors are useless. They bleed her, weakening her further. They apply hot plasters. They argue in Latin while the patient screams. By 3 a.m. on June 30th, 1670, just 9 hours after drinking the water, Henrietta of England takes her last breath. She was 26 years old. The moment she dies, the silence of the death chamber is replaced by the roar of rumor. It spreads from Saint-Cloud to Versailles, to Paris, and across the Channel to London. The verdict of the public is unanimous. The Chevalier de Lorraine has struck. The theory is specific and chillingly detailed. The gossips claim that the poison was sent from Rome by the exiled Chevalier. They say it was a special Italian poison, undetectable and swift. They claim it was delivered to his accomplices within the Palais Royal, specifically the Marquis d'Effiat, another of Monsieur's lovers and a creature of the Chevalier. The story goes that d'Effiat had rubbed the poison on the rim of Minette's cup, knowing she always drank from that specific vessel. This theory explains why the taster and the dog survived. They drank the liquid, but they didn't touch the rim where the poison sat. The political fallout is nuclear. England is furious. King Charles II is ready to tear up the Treaty of Dover and declare war on France for the murder of his sister. Louis XIV is terrified. He needs the alliance with England. He cannot afford a war sparked by a sordid domestic murder. The king orders an immediate autopsy. This is a highly unusual and gruesome step for a royal body. He invites the English ambassador and English surgeons to witness it, to ensure there is no cover-up. Imagine the scene: the beautiful dead body of the princess cut open under the flickering torchlight, surrounded by grave men looking for signs of arsenic or toad venom. The doctors find her stomach filled with bile, her intestines gangrenous, and her liver burnt entirely. In 1670, this burnt appearance is confusing. Today, modern medicine tells us Minette likely died of a catastrophic rupture of a gastric ulcer leading to acute peritonitis. It was a natural, albeit agonizing, death. But in the 17th century, the autopsy is inconclusive enough for the king to issue an official proclamation: death by natural causes, cholera morbus. The English ambassador, eager to avoid war, accepts the verdict. The treaty is saved. The peace holds. But in the corridors of Versailles, nobody believes it. Not really. The legend of the Chevalier de Lorraine as a poisoner is cemented. He is no longer just a greedy favorite. He is seen as a man who can reach across borders to kill a royal princess who stood in his way. He has become a figure of dark, almost supernatural dread. And Monsieur Philippe d'Orléans is now a widower. He wears the black of mourning, but his tears dry quickly. He has a new lever to pull. He goes to his brother, the king, with a cold ultimatum. "I need a wife," he says effectively. "I must marry again to provide heirs for France, but I will not marry. I will not produce children, and I will not cooperate with the state unless you bring him back." Louis XIV is trapped. He needs Philippe to marry. He needs the Orléans line to be secure, and he sees that Philippe is utterly broken without the Chevalier. The king realizes that the exile has failed. Distance has not severed the bond. It has only made Monsieur more obstinate. In 1672, the Sun King signs the order. The banishment is lifted. The return of the Chevalier de Lorraine is the triumph of the villain. He does not return quietly. He does not sneak back into Paris. He arrives like a conquering general. When his carriage enters the courtyard of the Palais Royal, Monsieur rushes out to meet him, weeping with joy, embracing him in front of the entire household. The message is clear to everyone. The king may rule France, but the Chevalier rules Monsieur. And now, the Chevalier is more powerful than he has ever been. He has survived the worst the king could do to him. He has survived the accusation of murder. He is untouchable. He looks around the Palais Royal and sees a kingdom without a queen. Minette is dead. Monsieur is his. The treasury is open, but the state requires a wife. And so the unfortunate replacement is summoned. Enter Elizabeth Charlotte of the Palatinate, known to history as Liselott. If Minette was a delicate English rose, Lieselot is a sturdy German oak. She is 20 years old, chubby, plain-faced, loud, and fond of hunting, beer, and sausages. She has no patience for fashion. She hates makeup, and she speaks her mind with a bluntness that shocks the refined French court. She arrives in France in 1671, filled with naive hope. She knows she is marrying a strange man, but she hopes for friendship. She hopes for a partnership. She walks into a lion's den. Lieselot's first meeting with the Chevalier de Lorraine is a moment of psychological horror. She describes him in her letters, which would become the greatest chronicle of the age, not as the beautiful angel of his youth, but as something decaying and sinister. By the early 1670s, the Chevalier's dissolute life is beginning to show. His face is pale, mask-like. He wears excessive amounts of makeup, rouge painted thick over his cheeks, patches covering blemishes. To Lieselot, he looks like a venomous reptile dressed in silk. And the Chevalier looks at this sturdy German country girl and sees exactly what he saw in Minette, an obstacle. He wastes no time. He convenes what Lieselot calls the cabal. This is his inner circle, his cousins, the Prince de Marsan and the Prince de Lillebonne, and his minions like the Marquis de Fiat. Their goal is simple: total isolation of the new Duchess. The psychological warfare begins on day one. The Chevalier advises Monsieur that his new wife is too German, too rustic, and embarrassing. They mock her accent. They laugh at her clothes. When she enters a room, the conversation stops, replaced by snickers behind fans. But the Chevalier's cruelty is not just social, it is structural. He sets out to ensure that Lieselot has zero influence over her husband's money or his decisions. In 1674, the Chevalier pulls off his masterstroke. It is a legal and financial coup that is breathtaking in its audacity. He convinces Monsieur to sign a formal contract regarding the management of the Orléans household. Philippe, who hates paperwork and finds numbers boring, is all too happy to agree. The document effectively appoints the Chevalier de Lorraine and his cronies as the absolute managers of the Duke's fortune. They control the appointments of all staff. They control the purchasing of all goods. They control the distribution of all pensions. Imagine the implications. If Lieselot wants a new dress, she has to ask the Chevalier's appointee for the money. If she wants to hire a new maid, the Chevalier has to approve the candidate. The Chevalier de Lorraine has effectively privatized the second most important royal household in France. He is the CEO of Monsieur Incourse, and he is looting the company. Lieselot writes home to her aunt in Germany, her letters stained with tears of rage. The Chevalier de Lorraine is the master of everything here. He has bewitched Monsieur. He steals from him with one hand and caresses him with the other. And I am treated like a piece of furniture that no one wants. She describes scenes that are heartbreaking in their domestic cruelty. One evening, Lieselot asks Monsieur for funds to repair the roof of her apartments, which is leaking. Monsieur shrugs, looking to the Chevalier. The Chevalier smiles his cold, beautiful smile and says, "Alas, madame, the treasury is empty this month. Perhaps if you spent less on your eccentric German foods." Yet, the very next day, the Chevalier appears at a ball wearing a coat covered in diamond buttons, a gift from Monsieur worth 10 times the cost of the roof repairs. It is blatant, it is humiliating, and it is absolute. The Chevalier also works to destroy the sexual relationship between husband and wife. Lieselot finds the act of sex with Monsieur comical and brief, but she knows it is her duty to produce heirs. The Chevalier, however, whispers in Monsieur's ear that sleeping with women is bad for his health, that it weakens his complexion, that it makes him look old. Monsieur, vain and obsessed with his fading youth, listens. He spends less and less time in his wife's bed and more time in the Chevalier's apartments, where the gambling goes on all night and the wine flows freely. This is the golden age of the Chevalier's power, from 1674 to roughly 1680. He is a king in all but name. He builds a life of staggering opulence. At the Palais Royal in Paris and the Château de Saint-Cloud, his apartments are better furnished than the king's own. He collects art, Raphael's, Titian's, not because he loves art, but because they are expensive. He employs a small army of servants who wear his livery, not Monsieur's. He brings his family, the Lorraines, into the heart of the court. The House of Lorraine had always been proud, considering themselves sovereign princes equal to the Bourbons. The Chevalier uses his position to demand that his family be given the rank of foreign princes, granting them precedence over the French dukes. This infuriates the ancient nobility of France. The dukes and peers are outraged that this sodomite favorite is elevating his clan above the great families of the realm. But they can do nothing. To attack the Chevalier is to attack Monsieur, and to attack Monsieur is to upset the king's peace. The Chevalier is acutely aware of the hatred surrounding him. He knows that if Monsieur dies, he is finished, so he becomes the guardian of Monsieur's health. He controls the doctors. He watches Monsieur's diet. He becomes a suffocating nursemaid, not out of love but out of self-preservation. He also manages Monsieur's other vices. Philippe has a wandering eye. He likes young men, very young men. The Chevalier, now approaching his mid-30s, is no longer the fresh-faced boy he once was. He cannot compete solely on beauty anymore. So, he evolves. He becomes the pimp. He finds young men for Monsieur, pretty vacuous boys who will amuse the prince for a few weeks but pose no intellectual threat. The Chevalier vets them. He trains them. He ensures they know who the real master is. If a boy becomes too ambitious, if he tries to whisper against the Chevalier, he disappears, dismissed, paid off, or threatened into silence. The Chevalier de Lorraine has built a perfect machine of control. He has the money, he has the prince, he has the fear of the court. But corruption has a smell. And in the late 1670s, a stench begins to rise from the gutters of Paris that will reach the very steps of the throne. It begins with whispers of black masses, of infants sacrificed on altars, of noble ladies buying powders to kill their husbands. The affaire des poisons, the affair of the poisons, is about to explode. The police chief of Paris, Gabriel Nicolas de Lorraine, begins to pull at a thread that unravels the dark underbelly of the City of Light. He arrests a fortune teller named Magdalene de Lagrange, then another, then the notorious Lavoisin. The year is 1682. The winter in Paris is cold, but the heat coming from the arsenal, the headquarters of the Paris police, is enough to scorch the reputation of every noble family in France. The Chambre Ardente, the burning court, is in session. In the dark, candlelit interrogation rooms, the king's lieutenant Gabriel Nicolas de Lorraine is staring into the abyss. He is listening to the confessions of women like Lavoisin, a midwife turned mass murderer who claims to have burned 2,500 infants in black masses. But it is not the dead babies that make Lorraine's hand tremble as he writes his reports. It is the client list. The accused witches are naming the highest ladies of the court, the Duchess of Bouillon, the Countess of Soissons, and then, inevitably, the name that has haunted the royal family for 20 years drops into the silence like a stone, the Chevalier de Lorraine. The testimony is damning. Witnesses claim the Chevalier was a regular in the Parisian underworld. They allege he purchased inheritance powders, the polite euphemism for arsenic and toad venom. They claim he sought spells to make himself invulnerable. They claim he bought love potions to slip into Monsieur's wine, ensuring the prince's devotion would never waver. For Louis XIV, sitting in his private cabinet at Versailles, reading these secret dossiers, the situation is a catastrophe. The ghost of Minette rises again. The shadow of the chicory water returns. If the Chevalier de Lorraine is publicly tried for witchcraft and poisoning, it will implicate Monsieur. If Monsieur is implicated, the crown itself is stained. The king faces a terrible choice: uphold justice and destroy his family's reputation, or bury the truth and let a monster walk free. But Louis faces a double betrayal. Not only is the Chevalier implicated in the poisons, but reports reach the king that the Chevalier and his circle have corrupted the king's own son, the young Count of Vermandois, drawing him into their debauched brotherhood. This is the final straw. The Chevalier is not just a poisoner. He is a rot spreading to the king's own blood. So, in January 1682, for the second time in his life, the Chevalier de Lorraine hears the boots of the musketeers outside his door. This arrest is different from the first. In 1670, it was a shock, a dramatic flare-up of temper. In 1682, it is cold, hard, and terrifyingly serious. There is no polite carriage ride this time. The Chevalier is stripped of his finery and dispatched to the fortress of Aigues-Mortes. If the Château d'If was a prison, Aigues-Mortes is a tomb. Located on the southern coast of France in the Camargue, it is a walled city surrounded by stagnant, mosquito-infested salt marshes. In the summer, the heat is hallucinatory. In the winter, the damp chills the bones. Malaria is endemic. Prisoners sent there are not expected to return healthy. Often, they are not expected to return at all. The Chevalier is 39 years old. He is no longer the resilient youth of 27. He is a man accustomed to the softest silk sheets, the richest foods, and the most constant flattery. Suddenly he is thrown into a stone cell where the water tastes of salt and the air smells of rot. Back at Versailles, the reaction is a grim echo of the past, but with a pathetic twist. Monsieur, now in his 40s, does not have the energy for the violent hysterics of his youth. Instead, he sinks into a deep, sullen depression. He stops gambling. He stops dressing up. He walks the halls of the Palais Royal like a ghost. He begins to neglect his religious duties, which, for a prince of the blood, is a form of political protest. He tells the king repeatedly, "I cannot live without him. I do not care what he has done. I do not care if he is a sorcerer. I need him." Liselotte, Monsieur's long-suffering wife, watches this with a mixture of disgust and pity. She writes, "Monsieur is in a state that would make a stone weep were the cause not so unworthy. He speaks of nothing but that man. He imagines him suffering, and he suffers with him. It is a sickness of the mind." But Louis XIV is fighting a war on two fronts. He is fighting the scandal of the poisons, and he is fighting the silence of his brother. The king realizes that the burning court is doing too much damage. It is exposing too many secrets. If he continues the trials, half the court will be in chains. So the Sun King makes a decision that historians still debate today. He shuts it down. He orders the Chambre Ardente to suspend its work. He burns the most damning testimonies. He decides that the stability of the monarchy is more important than the truth. And with the investigation closed, the justification for holding the Chevalier evaporates. After 7 months in the hell of Aigues-Mortes, the order for release is signed. When the Chevalier de Lorraine returns to court in late 1682, he is changed. The physical toll of the prison is visible. He has lost weight. His skin is sallow. He has a recurring cough, likely a souvenir of the malaria-ridden marshes. The angel of the court is beginning to fray at the edges, but psychologically, he is harder than ever. He has looked into the abyss of total ruin twice, and twice he has been pulled back by the sheer force of Monsieur's need for him. He realizes now that he is truly invincible. The king cannot destroy him, because the king cannot destroy Monsieur. The dynamic of the relationship shifts. The fiery, passionate, screaming matches of their youth are gone. In their place is something perhaps even more disturbing, a settled domestic toxicity. They become like an old married couple, bickering, codependent, and utterly inseparable. The Chevalier moves back into his apartments. He resumes his control of the finances, but he is quieter now. He is more discreet. He no longer flaunts his power with the reckless arrogance of the 1660s. Instead, he focuses on consolidation. He realizes that Monsieur is aging. Monsieur is becoming portly, his face lined, his health declining due to a lifetime of rich food and no exercise. The Chevalier knows that his own power is tied to this aging man's heartbeat. If Monsieur dies, the protection ends. So the Chevalier becomes the gatekeeper of Monsieur's mortality. He watches every mouthful of food Philippe eats, not to save him, but to prolong him. He manages the doctors. He ensures that Monsieur is never too excited, never too stressed. He wraps the prince in a cocoon of dull, expensive comfort. But a predator must eat. And if the Chevalier can no longer extract power through sex and scandal, he will extract it through his family. This is the era of the Lorraine aggrandisement. The Chevalier turns his attention to the next generation. He has nephews and cousins who need positions. He begins to pressure Monsieur to marry his children, the children of Lieselot, into the House of Lorraine. This is a massive insult to royal protocol. The House of Lorraine is noble, yes, but they are not royal. For a granddaughter of France, Monsieur's daughter, to marry a Lorraine is considered a mésalliance, a bad match. Lieselot fights this with every ounce of her German stubbornness. She views the Chevalier's family as parasites. She writes, "They are leeches. They want to mix their blood with ours to wash away their own irrelevance." And that wicked man, the Chevalier, whispers in Monsieur's ear day and night, telling him it is a good idea. The battle lines are drawn in the nursery. The Chevalier wants to secure his family's future before the sun sets on Monsieur's life. He uses every trick in the book. He bribes the children's governesses. He turns the children against their mother. There is a terrible story from this period where Lieselot's son, the future regent of France, is being corrupted by the Chevalier's circle. The Chevalier introduces the young boy to the debauched lifestyle of the Palais Royal, teaching him to gamble, to drink, and to mock religion. Lieselot watches helplessly as her son is molded in the image of the man she hates most in the world. She confronts Monsieur. "You are letting him ruin your son," she screams. Monsieur, adjusting his wig, replies coldly, "He is teaching him to be a gentleman of the world. You would have him be a boring German count." The Chevalier stands in the background, saying nothing, just smiling that thin, triumphant smile. He has won again. As the 1680s bleed into the 1690s, the court of Versailles itself is changing. The king, Louis XIV, is getting old. He has secretly married his pious mistress, Madame de Maintenon. The atmosphere of the court shifts from the wild parties of the early years to a somber religious devotion. Music is quieter, necklines are higher, gambling is frowned upon. But at the Palais Royal and Saint-Cloud, Monsieur's residences, the party never stops. It becomes a relic, a time capsule of the old days. And the Chevalier is the master of ceremonies in this museum of vice. He is now in his late 40s. He wears heavy makeup to hide the wrinkles. He wears corsets to hide the thickening waist. But his greed is undimmed. He begins to engage in a new kind of treachery. He starts to secretly correspond with the king's son, the Grand Dauphin. He sees that the wind is blowing toward the next generation. He betrays Monsieur's secrets to the Dauphin to curry favor. He plays both sides, ensuring that whoever sits on the throne, the Chevalier de Lorraine will have a friend. It is a masterclass in survival. Most favorites die young, or are exiled, or fade into poverty. The Chevalier de Lorraine is becoming an institution, but there is a hollowness to it all. Accounts from the time describe a man who is increasingly lonely. Despite being surrounded by people, he has no wife, he has no legitimate children. His lovers are bought and paid for, young boys who look at him not with desire, but with a calculation that mirrors his own. He spends his nights at the gambling tables betting sums that could feed a city. The cards are his only true escape. When he wins, he feels alive. When he loses, he simply signs a note that Monsieur will pay. One evening in the mid-1690s, a young courtier, the Duke of Saint-Simon, who would become the great chronicler of the age, observes the Chevalier de Lorraine at a supper. By now, the Chevalier's beauty had aged into something unsettling, less angelic, more mask-like, the cosmetic polish barely hiding a life of excess. Saint-Simon writes, "I saw him sitting there, the Chevalier de Lorraine. His beauty had aged into something unsettling, less angelic, more mask-like, the cosmetic polish, barely hiding a life of excess. He eats with a voracious appetite, as if he is trying to fill a hole that has no bottom. Everyone fears him, everyone hates him, and yet when he rises, the greatest dukes in France bow to him. It is a spectacle of the world upside down." The year is 1692. The Grand Siècle is drawing to a close. At Versailles, the atmosphere has shifted. The endless parties of the king's youth are gone. Louis XIV has become pious, rigid, imposed by the suffocating morality of Madame de Maintenon. But there is one place where the old ways still reign supreme, acting as a defiant island of debauchery, the household of Monsieur. Under the candlelight of the Palais Royal, the Chevalier de Lorraine is still the master of ceremonies. But looking closer, the cracks are visible. He is approaching 50, a relic of a bygone era. He paints his face to hide the gray pallor of his skin. He suffers from dizzy spells and headaches, but he refuses to retire. To retire is to admit that he is just a man. Yet the Chevalier, ever the pragmatist, knows the end is near. He looks at his lover, Monsieur, and sees a ticking clock. Philippe is now obese, short of breath, his face constantly flushed red. The cord that binds the Chevalier to power, Philippe's life, is fraying. The Chevalier knows that when that clock stops, the protection of 40 years vanishes. He knows the king despises him. He knows Liselot prays daily for his death. He needs one last big score. One final consolidation of wealth that no one, not even the king, can touch. And so, in the twilight of the 17th century, the Chevalier de Lorraine begins his most dangerous game yet. He decides to blackmail the King of France. The Chevalier needs an insurance policy. He needs to make himself indispensable to the king, not just to the king's brother. And in 1692, the opportunity presents itself. It is a crisis of blood. Louis XIV has a problem. He has several illegitimate children, his bastards, by his mistress Madame de Montespan. He loves them dearly, more than his legitimate family. He wants to legitimize them, to weave them into the royal line. Specifically, he wants to marry his illegitimate daughter, Mademoiselle de Blois, to his nephew, the Duke of Chartres, Monsieur's only son and heir. This is a scandalous proposition. In the hierarchy of the 17th century, Royal blood is sacred. To mix the pure blood of the House of Orléans with the bastard blood of the king's mistress is seen as a pollution. Lieselot is horrified. When she hears the rumor, she screams that she would rather see her son dead than married to a mouse dropping, her colorful term for the king's illegitimate child. Monsieur, terrified of his wife's temper and proud of his own rank, refuses the king's request. The king is stuck. He cannot force his brother to consent to a marriage without causing a rupture that would humiliate his daughter. He needs someone on the inside, someone who can bend Monsieur's will. He needs the Chevalier de Lorraine. This is the moment of the blackmail, or perhaps more accurately, the great betrayal. The king's emissaries approach the Chevalier in secret. The deal is laid out on the table. If the Chevalier can use his influence to force Monsieur to agree to this shameful marriage, the king will reward him. The rewards promised are staggering. The Order of the Holy Spirit, the highest chivalric order in France. For the Chevalier's brother, massive financial bonuses and a guarantee of protection. It is a deal with the devil. To accept it, the Chevalier must betray the House of Orléans. He must sell the honor of the family that has sheltered him for 30 years. He must force the boy he helped raise, the young Duke of Chartres, into a marriage he does not want. The Chevalier does not hesitate for a second. He takes the deal. He goes to work on Monsieur. The manipulation is masterful. He doesn't argue for the marriage's merits. He argues from fear. He tells Monsieur that the king is losing patience. He whispers that if Monsieur refuses, the king might cut off his pension. He suggests that this marriage is the only way to secure the future of the Chevalier's own friends. A subtle threat that if Monsieur doesn't agree, the Chevalier will be unhappy. Monsieur, as always, crumples. He cannot stand the pressure. He cannot stand the idea of the Chevalier being displeased. He agrees to the marriage. The fallout is spectacular. When Lieselot finds out that her husband has capitulated, she goes into a rage that becomes legendary. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, in front of the entire court, she walks up to her son, who has just agreed to the marriage, and slaps him across the face so hard the sound echoes off the glass. The king witnesses this. The court witnesses this. It is a moment of supreme humiliation for the Orléans family. But in the shadows, watching with a satisfied smirk, is the Chevalier de Lorraine. He has delivered the goods. He has proven that he is the only man in France who can manage Monsieur. He has secured his payout. For the rest of the 1690s, the Chevalier lives on the proceeds of this betrayal. But the victory is hollow. The atmosphere at Saint-Cloud becomes toxic. Lieselot now treats the Chevalier not just as an enemy, but as a traitor. The young Duke of Chartres, trapped in an unhappy marriage, turns to debauchery to numb the pain, a path the Chevalier happily encourages as it keeps the young Duke weak and manageable. However, time is the one enemy the Chevalier cannot blackmail. As the 18th century dawns, the physical decline of the partners in crime accelerates. Monsieur is eating himself to death. He has become grossly obese. His face is perpetually flushed. He suffers from dropsy and shortness of breath. The Chevalier, too, is falling apart. He suffers from terrible headaches and fainting spells. But unlike Monsieur, who eats to comfort himself, the Chevalier gambles. He plays with a desperation that frightens observers. He loses thousands of livres in a night, signing IOUs that he knows Monsieur will cover. It is the behavior of a man who knows the end is near and wants to consume everything before the lights go out. The relationship between the two old men becomes tragic. They still sleep in adjoining rooms. They still write to each other if they are apart for even a day. But the spark is gone, replaced by a terrified clinging. They are two shipwreck survivors on a raft, holding on to each other as the ocean rises. And then comes June 1701. The crisis begins, as always, with a family argument. The Duke of Chartres, Monsieur's son, is openly parading his mistress in front of his wife, the king's daughter. The king is furious. He feels that Monsieur is failing to control his son. On June 8, 1701, Monsieur travels to the Château de Marly to meet the king. The meeting is a disaster. Louis XIV, usually so controlled, loses his temper. He shouts at his brother, accusing him of being a bad father, of allowing his son to shame the royal family. But on this day, Monsieur fights back. Perhaps it is the years of resentment boiling over. Perhaps it is the knowledge that he has sacrificed everything, his honor, his wife's happiness, for the king's demands. Monsieur turns purple with rage. He yells back at the Sun King. He points out the king's hypocrisy. "You complain about my son's mistresses?" Monsieur shouts. "What about your own? You have filled France with your bastards. You are the one who forced this marriage on us." The courtiers outside the door can hear the shouting. It is a breach of protocol so severe, it is almost treasonous. Monsieur storms out of the meeting, his chest heaving, his face a dangerous shade of crimson. He gets into his carriage and returns to Saint-Cloud. He is agitated, furious, and physically unwell. To calm himself, he does what he always does. He goes to find the Chevalier. They sit down to dinner that evening at Saint-Cloud. It is a humid, heavy night. Monsieur is still fuming about the argument with his brother. He eats voraciously, consuming rich meats and wine, trying to bury his anger in food. The Chevalier sits opposite him, picking at his cards, listening to the ranting. Suddenly, around 10 p.m., Monsieur stops speaking. His eyes widen. He makes a strange gargling sound. He slumps forward onto the table, knocking over a glass of wine. The room freezes. The Chevalier stands up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Monsieur?" There is no answer. Philippe, Duke of Orléans, slides from his chair and crashes onto the floor. It is a massive stroke. Panic erupts. Servants scream. Doctors are summoned. They bleed him, cutting his arm to let the bad blood out, but it does nothing. He is carried to his bed, unconscious, breathing in heavy, terrifying rasps. Messengers are dispatched to Versailles. The king is woken up. At first, Louis XIV does not come. He thinks it is just another one of Philippe's dramatic episodes. But as the reports come in, he does not speak. One side of his body is dead. The reality sinks in. Back at Saint-Cloud, the scene in the bedroom is a tableau of the Chevalier's life dissolving. Lieselotte rushes in, terrified. The children are crying, but the Chevalier de Lorraine. Eyewitnesses describe a chilling reaction. The Chevalier does not throw himself on the body. He does not weep hysterically, as Monsieur did for him so many times. He stands by the bed looking down at the dying man. He sees the labored breathing. He sees the gray face, and his mind, the mind of the ultimate survivor, instantly calculates the equation. Monsieur is dying. The protection is gone. The king hates me. The Chevalier de Lorraine does not wait for the final breath. While Monsieur is still gasping for air, the Chevalier quietly leaves the room. He goes to his own apartments and begins to pack. He gathers his jewels. He gathers his papers, the incriminating letters, the financial contracts. He knows that the moment Philippe's heart stops, the king's officers will be coming. He has to secure his loot. It is the final brutal proof of the nature of their relationship. For Monsieur, it was love. For the Chevalier, it was a career. And the job is now over. At 12 p.m. the next day, June 9th, 1701, Philippe, Duke of Orléans, dies. The king arrives at Saint-Cloud shortly after. He weeps for his brother, genuinely heartbroken. But through his tears, his eyes scan the room with cold, steely resolve. He is looking for one man. He turns to the captain of the guard. Where is the Chevalier de Lorraine? He is in his room, sire, waiting. The king has waited 40 years for this moment. The shield is down. The viper is exposed. Tell him, the king says, his voice a whisper that carries the weight of a guillotine blade, that he has to leave now. The Chevalier de Lorraine does not argue. He knows the rules of the game better than anyone. He knows that his power was never truly his own. It was a borrowed light. Now that the mirror is broken, the light is extinguished. Within hours, the eviction is complete. The magnificent apartments at Versailles, where he had plotted, seduced, and ruled for 30 years, are stripped. His livery is removed. The servants who once bowed to him now look past him, their eyes already scanning the horizon for the next rising star. He retreats to Paris, to the Palais Royal. But even there, he is no longer the master. He is a tenant. He is no longer the angel or the devil. He is just an old man with too much makeup and a bad reputation waiting to be forgotten. The king, Louis XIV, is ruthless in his cleanup. He seizes the moment to reclaim what was lost. He cancels many of the pensions Monsieur had lavished on the Chevalier. He demands the return of certain jewels. He systematically dismantles the financial empire the Chevalier had built on his brother's weakness. However, the Chevalier is not destitute. He is a survivor. He has squirreled away enough gold in his 40 years of dominance to live like a prince until the end of his days. He retreats to his beautiful apartments, surrounded by his art collection, his tapestries, and his memories. But the silence is deafening. For the next 18 months, the Chevalier de Lorraine exists in a strange twilight state. He tries to maintain his routine. He goes to the opera. He hosts suppers. He gambles furiously, the stakes getting higher and higher, as if he is trying to feel something, anything, to replace the adrenaline of power. But the court, that cruel living organism, has moved on. Lieselot, the widow, is finally free. Her letters from this period are almost manic with relief. She writes, "The old manure heap is finally being swept out of the stable. He wanders around Paris like a ghost. No one fears him anymore. I look at him and I wonder how I ever let such a painted scarecrow terrify me." It is the ultimate punishment for a narcissist, irrelevance. The end comes on December 7th, 1702. The Chevalier is playing cards at the Palais Royal. He is telling stories of the old days, of the balls in 1660, of the time he defied the king. The young courtiers around the table are listening politely, but their eyes are glazing over. They are waiting for him to finish so they can go to the real parties. Suddenly, the Chevalier drops his hand. He feels a rushing sound in his ears. The room tilts. He collapses at the gaming table. It is apoplexy, a stroke, the exact same fate that took Monsieur. He's carried to his bed. He lingers for a few hours, unable to speak, his eyes darting around the room in panic. Perhaps he sees the ghosts of his past gathering at the foot of the bed. Perhaps he sees Minette clutching her stomach. Perhaps he sees Monsieur weeping. On the morning of December 8th, 1702, Philippe de Lorraine Armagnac, the Chevalier de Lorraine, dies. He is 59 years old. The reaction to his death is chilling. There are no public tears. There is no grand state funeral. When the news reaches Versailles, Louis XIV is told that the man who tormented his family for 4 decades is dead. The Sun King, who is usually meticulous about offering condolences, simply shrugs. He reportedly says he was a man who caused much trouble. It is a pity he did not die sooner. Lieselot's reaction is even more savage. She writes to her aunt, "The Chevalier de Lorraine is dead. They say he died as he lived, debauched and unrepentant. I felt a great weight lift from my shoulders. The air in Paris seems cleaner today." He is buried quickly with minimal ceremony at the convent of the Ave Maria in Paris. In the chaos of the French Revolution decades later, his tomb would be destroyed, his bones scattered. Today there is no monument to him. No statue stands in the gardens of Versailles to mark his existence, and yet his story is not one of failure. As we look back at the 120-minute journey we have taken, from the Weeping Prince in 1670 to the silent deathbed in 1702, we must recognize the terrifying achievement of this man. The Chevalier de Lorraine was a cadet with no prospects who forced the world to bend to his will. He proved that in a system designed for absolute male primogeniture, where the king was God, there was a back door to power. That back door was love, or, if not love, then obsession. He was a monster, yes. He was a domestic abuser, a gaslighter, a parasite, and quite possibly a murderer. But he was also a pioneer of a specific kind of survival. He lived openly as a homosexual man in a century that burned sodomites. He lived without shame in an era of suffocating morality. He looked the Sun King in the eye and refused to blink. He leaves us with a final, uncomfortable question about history. We like to think that history is made by great battles, by treaties, by the decisions of wise ministers. The story of the Chevalier de Lorraine proves otherwise. It proves that history is also made in the bedroom. It is made in the whispered arguments between lovers. It is made by jealousy, by insecurity, and by the desperate, messy human need not to be alone. He entered Versailles as a pretty boy from a ruined house. He left it as the man who proved that even the most absolute monarch in Europe could be ruled, not by ministers, not by generals, but by the lover of his own brother. The Sun King reigned, but for 40 years, in the shadows of the Palais Royal, the Chevalier de Lorraine ruled.